everybody. Hi, everybody. Glad to have everybody joining us virtually and really excited we can do this event to kick off our lecture series on the spring semester. So welcome to the first Tulane School of Architecture spring lecture of our 2020-2021 series titled Inhabiting the Planet. In this lecture series, we analyze and discuss the way humans are and could be inhabiting the planet from different perspectives, and how architecture intersects with social, racial, environmental, economic, and health issues. Tonight, we are joined by Andrés Jaque for a discussion about human inhabitation and politics. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the ASBE Fund, and we thank them very much for their support. Since these events are virtual, we've aimed to make them as dynamic as possible. Therefore, after Andrés' initial presentation, Andrés will be joined by two additional respondents for an interdisciplinary conversation. The two respondents for tonight's event include Neil Kleiman, an urban policy professor at the Tulane School of Professional Advancement's Master in Public Administration program, and Margarita Joubert, associate professor in architecture at Tulane School of Architecture. After a discussion amongst the three presenters, they will then take questions from the audience for the last 30 minutes of the session. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and either the speakers or Kristen Jones will read them out loud. Now to introduce our main lecturer, Andrés Jaque is the founder and principal of the Office for Political Innovation. Jaque founded the Office for Political Innovation in 2003. He has brought a trans-sectional approach to architectural design, practicing architecture as the intervention on complex composites of relationships, where its agency is negotiated with other entities. Andrés Jaque is director of the Advanced Architectural Design program at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. He has also been visiting professor at Princeton University and the Cooper Union. Andrés received his PhD in architecture from the Escuela Técnica Superior de Arquitectura de Madrid, where he also received his MArch. He has been an Alfred Topfer Stiftung Tessenau Stipendiat. I don't know if I pronounced that all correctly, so forgive me. And also a Graham Foundation grantee. In 2018, he co-curated Manifesta 12 in Palermo. He has published 7 books, including his most recent, Transmaterial Politics in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Andrés.
Thank you very much. I'm super happy to be here, and I'm happy to be today in conversation with all of you, and very especially with Neil and Margarita as well. Benjamin, thanks so much for this very kind presentation. So I'm going to go right to the point, and I'll go quite fast actually, so we can initiate the conversation as well. Oh, sorry, we started in the fire. Okay, here. Okay, yeah, I would like to, some of the ideas that I'm going to present today are also part of this book that I just launched, Superpowers of Scale, that are kind of reflecting on the way contemporary architectural practices can, or rather than that, what is the way that scale operates politically, and how we can basically make the best of the potential of architectural practices, and in coordination and cooperation with others, with other practices and other disciplines to really gain or rethink the way we operate politically. And this "we" is kind of problematic. We will be discussing it, of course, to the night, to the evening, probably. I'd like to start with this image that for me it's been quite important. This is a photograph from, basically it's the first photograph that was taken from one of the most photographed architectural devices. And that is a question that has been with me for years now. This is a photograph I took of the basement of the Barcelona Pavilion that Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich designed in the first place in 1929, and then it was rebuilt in the 1980s. And it's been momentous in the way modern architecture has been shaped, as it is part of the evolution of Barcelona and a big part of the ideas of architecture and urban planning and urban design in the last decades. For me, it's quite a question to think why such a photograph device, architectural device, the Barcelona Pavilion, had 70% of its, let's say, architecture never been seen or kind of never circulated as an architectural evidence to be discussed. So basically, these are the kind of images that are constantly circulating. And when we see here water, a body that is highly genderized, the Stinos marble, the trees behind it, there's so much heterogeneity being composed together here. Why that part needed to be removed, why other components that could be adding to this heterogeneity are on the need of being invisibilized. This is actually the way I'd like to think of the Barcelona Pavilion as a two-story building. And what is that we can learn by the way these two stories relate to each other? The column that you see there, it's precisely on the base, at the basement, is precisely the one that is taking the load of the Kolbe sculpture. So you see exactly how this is aligned, at the same time how disaligned it is. So many things happen at the basement that could never happen, or that would never happen upstairs. Like for instance, the microwave that is used by the employees to warm up their lunches basically needs to be invisibilized down there in order not to kind of conflict the experience that the visitors are expected to find in the Barcelona Pavilion, this kind of emptiness that they want to confirm, that they've seen in the photographs. They go to Barcelona and they want to have it again. But when we look at these images, there's so much of Lily Rai here. There's so much of modernity, this kind of frontal disposition of, or kind of display of broken stones with these Futura numbers on the wall. It's so much similar to the way Mies van der Rohe and mostly Lily Rai would design the way heterogeneous entities could be gaining space together, could be kind of negotiating politically their presence in a common space. So why this needs to be removed? That's kind of the question. This is the curtain when it was placed new. This is a few months later. This is when it ends up in the basement. The basement is basically this big part of the pavilion that makes it, produces the fantasy that the upper part can stay forever young, never changing, empty, disconnected to the social, disconnected environmentally and politically, sort of detached, autonomous, and disentangled. So the relationship of the upper floor and the basement is very much like this for me. Something needs to be kind of absorbing a big part of the entanglement the pavilion is part of in order to preserve this kind of collective fantasy. So what is that we can learn about architecture if we are dependent on this sort of fantasy? But the most intriguing part of it for me, it's Gata Niebla. It's this cat that we see here. And that is where I'd like to start this conversation maybe. Gata Niebla was brought to the pavilion when she was very close to when she was born. And she was taken there to basically become an actor of this cosmopolitical composition that the pavilion is by basically hunting the mice in the pavilion. It's not a tiny detail because, as many of you know, probably Mies van der Rohe was obsessed with plants and ecology. He was collecting all these plants, as he was about material politics. When he was asked, when he arrived to the US, what a journalist asked him, what is the magazines, the architectural magazines that you read to become an architect? And he would respond, I never looked at architecture magazines. I was reading political magazines. But not of the sort of politics that politicians talk about, the kind of politics that Walter Lippmann, one of the fathers of pragmatism in the US, and for many people, one of the founders also of political and technological notions of politics, that was what he was interested on. So why this kind of incapacity for architecture now to operate probably in the pavilion as a two-story building. Cat Niebla, by living in the basement in this place here, in the darkness all day long, basically, she developed atrophia, macular atrophia. So when she was kind of older, she could not see the upper floor. It's very important for me, this, because somehow it talks of the reflectivity of architecture, how much we do architecture, but how much we are done by architecture, how much we are produced by architecture itself, as societies, but also as individuals, as bodies, and as bodies that expand across scales. So this is for me sort of the way that I've been thinking architecture more as a bodied and collectively bodied practice, and a practice in which design has to do not that much with reinvent or kind of inventing anew, but rearticulating the social, the environmental, the ecological together. Like my intervention in this pavilion was actually reorganize the position of elements, the way they would relate to each other, sort of seeing how, what were the kind of relationships that were holding this ecosystem together politically, and being kind of disturbing them, rearticulating them, even dissident to them. And I believe that architecture now is sort of doing this. The kind of architecture that I'm thinking of, it's probably not thinking of society as something that could be created anew, but rather that is already constituted, and that architecture is operating also as part of it, entangled with it. And that sort of state of architecture of being imbricated in the ecosystems life is accommodated in, or it's produced by, or it's produced through. That for me, it's crucial. And then knowing that those ecosystems are run by forms of hegemonies, somehow architecture has the capacity of being disturbing these hegemonies, bringing alternative and even producing kind of forms of dissidence that could generate other spaces. And this is something that, of course, has a trajectory in architecture. When we think of the influence of Georgi Kepes in thinking across scales, and thinking architecture as something that is composed by the heterogeneous, and that is basically that capacity of creating, intervening and kind of rearticulating the ecosystemical tissues and tissues of relationships life is accommodated through, that probably it's what is behind this. And of course, this is something that was very well known by the IMESs in this huge mobilization of diverse technologies in producing solidarity between bodies and objects, bodies and landscapes, objects, bodies, landscapes, societies, ecosystems, galaxies. And that was what was reflected in this movie. But I've been highly disturbed by this centrality and this kind of seemingly continuity that is avoiding a big part of the politics that are behind these images, and the big part of the conflict, the responses, the disagreements, the difference, the forms of politics that somehow are repressed here in this continuous or non-discontinuous movement from genes to galaxies. Framing the social, of course, was a big part of what the images stand for, their practice. They were always framing this heterosexual couple that could control technology as the center of the universe. And that's really this fun, happy, powerful, and kind of playful center for the universe was what they were framing once and again. And it was highly staged from their clothes to their uses of technology, to their smiles, to their relationship, to everything was staged. Framing the social was what they were doing, what they did as a form of design, and framing it in a way that an interscalar, not transcalar, but interscalar continuity could be enforced and being seen as natural, as a given, as non-constructed, as the only possible option that was actually threatened. And this, they were learning this from Kees Booker and Betty Cadbury, that were the authors of Cosmic View, the Universe in 40 Jumps, this book that Kees Booker did, and that was the origin of Powers of 10. Kees Booker is not that well known. He's known as a pedagogist, but he was actually an architect. Here with his partner, Betty Cadbury. Betty Cadbury was the granddaughter of the founder of Cadbury Chocolates. They lived in that in a town, in one of the Cadbury town companies, and company towns, and they were learning that it was, or they would defend that this town was much better run than any democratically run community, and then they would defend this kind of idea of sociocracy, that everything was centralized and would be administrated as in a corporation through consensus and avoiding the representation of minorities. When we look at the Zoom itself, the big device of Powers of 10, we see how much it is hiding diversity itself. These are the lenses that are in this 1956 Zoom that became basically the new trend in all sort of filming language, but was actually producing this fantasy again of the discontinuous being perceived as continuous. And actually anyone that is keen on photography will know how much you can see the distortions as you move from one lens to the other, and how much effort is put in kind of making it, or kind of making up for them, or cosmetically avoid the perception of the transitions from one lens to the other. And that's precisely what the images were doing in Powers of 10. Basically, they would use all sorts of tricks to avoid explaining how difficult it was, or how problematic, how much politics were needed to transition from one scale to the other. And that's precisely where I think contemporary programs for architecture are allocated, in those difficult transitionings. For instance, this is a photogram from one cell that is being attacked by a virus, that was removed from the photograms of the first version of Powers of 10, the rough sketch, intentionally. Basically, this was the origin of this work that we did a few years ago, Powers of 10, that was a reenactment, Super Powers of 10, actually, that was a reenactment of Powers of 10, where basically we were repeating as a scientific experiment the setting of this movie, the images, how they would relate to each other, and trying to see what were the moments that actually were failing, that were not working, that we had to refigure how to deal with. And there were many. For instance, this is Philip Morrison, the voice, the scientific advisor for the movie, and also the guy that was giving the voiceover for the film. And actually, he would never be a character within this movie. He had polio when he was a kid. He actually ended up his days in a wheelchair for a long time. He was quite ill. He was actually not believing that there was the air was so peaceful as he would show. He was part of the Manhattan Project. He actually was repeating with Powers of 10 what he had previously done with the A-bomb that he contributed to develop. Powers of 10 is kind of a weapon that was expanding across scales in the same way that the atoms were breaking in the A-bomb that Morrison helped developing. He was then taken to Hiroshima to assess on site the effects of the bomb, and he became immediately an activist against the proliferation of nuclear weapons when he saw the effects of it, and became one of the founders of Los Alamos group of scientists that would be advocating actually, he would never believe in the emptiness of the galaxy that he was claiming, his voice was claiming in the film. He published this piece in Nature in 1959, previous to the movie is from 1977, Powers of 10, where he would defend that there was life out there and that there were scientists could get in touch with these extraterrestrial beings. He actually developed in Ohio State University this big ear antenna to communicate. He contributed to it. There were also other people involved to contribute to get in touch with extraterrestrial aliens or beings. And actually, there was a moment that they thought they had communicated with them. But not only that, if we look at the Lounge, that was basically the moment that Brilliant was massively being distributed. The movie is kind of hiding the entire conflicts that were happening already in the Lounge, which the Lounge across the US were seen in an incredibly short period of time, in less than 5 years, their biodiversity being reduced by 100%. So basically that was a battle that was happening at the scales of genes. And the biodiversity of the Lounge that is not seen in the movie as the camera moves to the scale of the grass. The actual film in which that was used to shoot the movie was Kodachrome, this film that was famous because it was calibrated with the Cindy cards that were reproducing this very particular skin. At the time that, of course, the kids were being taken to schools from all around the country to confront whiteness, and basically non-white kids could not be properly depicted by the photographs that were taken in high schools. And that became a huge conflict. So basically, when we look around, and even in the moment that the genes are connected to the gender of or the sex in the genes are connected to the gender performance and composition of the bodies, that was already kind of a huge thing in LA. There were so many cases of trans activism that was happening. So basically, in between the frames, there's so much discussion, there's so much alternative, so much dissidence, so much conflict, so many controversies that were smoothed up by the film. And I wonder if it's not precisely those things that could emerge as the Zoom that were smoothed up and made disappear, exactly the ones that we're dealing with now. I have the feeling that our practice now, it's really about redoing a big part of what we have inherited and taking care of all these forms of politics that were avoided, if not neglected, by architecture historically. And actually the disposition of all these conflicts, the space to be dealt with, it's in itself a form of architecture that is also being occupied by other fields. This is, for instance, Bruno Latour, that initiated his discussion Reset Modernity in ZKM in Karlsruhe, by inhabiting very physically with a large number of intellectuals, activists, the setting of the set for this film, for this alternative version of it, for this staged theater piece that we did, as a way for architecture not that much to neutrally host society, but actually mobilizing society through its conflicts, through its unresolved issues that require rearticulation, require politics to be participated by others. And this is kind of what practice is about and what we've been doing, a form of using design in the intersection with research and activism to not basically do everything ourselves, but to create and contribute to initiate processes where others can jump in and collaborate and basically address issues that are not resolved and that require political evolution and political collaboration. I will give you now to finish a small glimpse to what we're doing now, the projects that we're developing now. And I think that they're all meant to multiply the spectrum of what is possible. This Isabel Stenger's cosmopolitical proposal. And some of the projects that we're doing are continuing what we've done with other projects, like the Scarabox, which is this kind of space for material participation, or this is one that we're doing now that is continuing that, but creating an interface, like an architecture that it's like an embassy or kind of a medium that allows humans to renegotiate their relationship with non-human beings, especially the ones that are composing the ocean, or humans relating to our oceanic dimension. And this is the project that we're doing now for the Thyssen-Bornemisza Contemporary Art Collection in Venice, in Castello, that will include and will kind of make it possible to build this Parliament of the Ocean that is being developed in collaboration with scientists, artists, digital artists, to make it possible for humans to sense what's happening to other beings, and also for other beings to get in communication with humans. And this should become a platform where new policy could be developed and decisions could be made on the basis of mutual sensing. This is a very, very exciting project that we're developing now. Or for instance, a project like this that we're developing in Corpus Christi in Texas, which is a tiny, tiny project, almost a cabin, but a cabin that is operating not really like to cater human needs, but rather by catering human needs, also gaining the opportunity to collect water and release it to the island at the moments that the salinity on the earth or the lack of humidity is jeopardizing the survivance of the arboreal mass, of which the erosion of the island, or kind of the slowing down of the erosion of the island, depends on. This is basically an architecture that is catering rather than any other thing to the erosion, to preserving the topography of the island as long as is possible, to prevent the Laguna Grande in Corpus Christi to be rapidly disappearing with its huge environmental capital. But I would like to finish now talking about New York and about this, because it's an architectural question. And an architectural question that we need to work across scales to understand. And this 432, a building that for many people is quite elegant. It's kind of dividing architectural practitioners, because some of them think that, well, it's just a beautiful building. What does it have to do with the growth of inequality in a place like New York or across the world? But when we look carefully, it's very different. This is the first image that D-Box produced. And I want to pay attention to the fact that this almost invisible filtering that is allowing for the landscape to be owned by this guy, this flamboyant guy on this kind of expensive collection, modern chair. This is actually what is happening. This is not naive. This image is not naive at all. This is the conceptual image that was used to solve the whole concept of the apartments. Basically, by buying one of these apartments, you can own the landscape. And this is very literally what is happening. It all comes, of course, historically from the lack of the difficulties that New York had in developing an economy after Elizabeth took over the activity of the harbor. New York could not compete due to the lack of space for trucks and standardized ship containers with New Jersey, and basically devoid of an economy. It's been historically dealt with through real estate, and a very particular kind of real estate that, of course, grew in the last years, and that Bloomberg very, very sharply defined through this idea that billionaires could be a godsend. And of course, what we've been all following the newspapers, the use of LLCs as cell companies to buy properties in New York, tax abatements or reductions, the possibility of using buildings as tax havens across the world, in particular cities like London or New York. It's actually interesting to see that the newspapers, when they were depicting the participation of architecture in tax evasion, they were all of them kind of picturing it as these kind of houses, like white houses in the tropics, in islands, whereas actually it's probably much more effective to see what was the difficulty that the European Union found to say what countries were actually tax havens, because they immediately had the USA, Luxembourg, Germany, Japan, Panama, of course, United Kingdom, Turkey, Chile, Netherlands, Israel, Guatemala, Belgium, Ireland. Like basically tax havens were not in remote islands only, but were actually already a new layer that was introduced within the cities that were basically operating internationally. So when we come to this is what this looks like. The possibility of overlapping that layer was also happening with the participation of architectural design, articulated and combined and coordinated with other forms of design. It mobilized from aesthetics. This is Cocky Boys, a gay porn studio from New York, a hipster porn studio in Red Hook. This is Jake Jackson, that would be another story, the partner of Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald in the past. These images that 432 D-Box developed for 432 to sell the apartments basically were very much inspired by images of cocky boys like this that were developing a technique to film and to shoot sex scenes in front of windows, sexualizing the ownership of views. As we see in images like this is a staged image to sell the apartments. Christina Makowski, the Sport Illustrated a model that was selected among 400 candidates by D-Box, is wearing this Armani version of this Lanvin shirtless suit that Kim Kardashian was making famous in this Instagram image that was one of the most successful for many years. When we go to the background, we see that there's this scene of three guys, the most important being this chubby guy here is the only one that is not an actor. The D-Box people called him the Danny DeVito guy and was actually a businessman from New Jersey. Friends of Matthew Bannister, the CEO of D-Box, the architectural company that is authoring the renderings for this project. And that is basically literally making it plausible to think that the buyers of these apartments could have this kind of access to windows, views, and sex in a way. These photographs were introduced only in 400 issues of these magazines that were distributed in the Ritz-Carlton hotel in places like Moscow. So people in the middle of the night, guys in the middle of the night with jet lag would basically go through the pages and they would end up calling their brokers to buy these apartments. But it comes with this. Basically in Times Warner Towers, there's Dr. Sang. Dr. Sang believes that it's crucial that he's there, once because the Times Warner Towers are in the middle, in the center of the center, and they are the center of power, and there's this kind of quotes in an interview that I did to him. He's the inventor of the three-parent baby. He's notorious for basically catering to billionaires and celebrities and basically screening genes from a number of people to design their kids. Designers' babies, he called them the three-parent technique. This is the celebrities' room. It has its own access. Actually, it's used often also for surrogates. So together with surrogates, screening, recombination of genes, that is happening before the embryo is produced. So it allows for different religions to also be part of this. But this moment, it's the scale in which also these societies produce out of the combination of genes. These are the cryobank service lookalike. Actually, the most expensive semen donors are the ones that have a resemblance with these two guys. Actors that are well known because they are equally attractive to Asian and to Western people, and therefore they are producing the kids that are most successfully operating across continents. So when we look at this, we look at the sky. It doesn't have this yellowish color that New York had in the 80s, which is crucial here. That is the result of the architectural detailing that use ultra clear glass, very highly calibrated or very specifically calibrated to maximize the blue part of the natural light spectrum. This ultra clear glass is used in almost every single high-end apartment building across the world. It allows to calibrate and control the sky, the color of the sky. But it's also directly related to the increase of emissions during the production process. Basically, ultra clear glass requires 73% more consumption of gas, and that's why it's so much produced in combination with the extraction of natural gas in Susquehanna Valley through fracking. Actually, that's the core of the production of glass in the US, but also in combination with the silica extraction in Illinois. And that is, so ultra clear glass was initially possible, and it was developed by PPG because there was this high availability of both very wide silica in Illinois, and this in connection and kind of in proximity with this huge provision of natural gas that fracking was making possible. So basically, what is kind of a question mark again for our field, for architecture and combination with others, is why this highly polluting element, the ultra clear glass, automatically gives 2 points in the LEED seal of environmental performance, basically by using a material that is highly polluting. Basically it gives you points, LEED's points, and of course that's but that is all to say that architectural detailing is a form of socio-territorial recomposition. So there's nothing new in what I'm saying. It's only new if we want to use it against advanced capitalism and operate there to provide other alternatives to this. Actually, it's interesting to see that that there's even kind of a difficulty in track the ethics of many of these actions, because good intentions are often behind many of these articulations. For instance, this is the Clean Air project by Bloomberg that was combined with the Clean Heat project that was transforming the boilers in New York City from oil to gas. But that happened at the same time that Cuomo accepted to ban hydraulic fracturing in New York State, basically the one that required horizontal development, which was actually probably not the bad thing to do, but of course it has effects. And the fact is that all that gas extraction was moved to Susquehanna Valley. And if all that happened in 2011, we can see here immediately the effects of banning fracking at the same time in New York State, at the same time that the boilers were being transformed, in the way the emissions of NOx that were being reduced in New York were automatically taken or where, I mean, it's of course impossible to track exactly where it went, but basically we could see how they were racing at that particular moment in Susquehanna. So basically, what we see here is a confrontation of two forms of, again, like relating to a very particular asset, the Marcellus cell, that is perceived by people that are living on top of it like that, like fire coming from, or kind of their water being fire, and of course becoming an asset that could be marketed in stocks like in future stocks like this as derivatives. This kind of probably it's for me it's the most intriguing image of this research that we've been doing. That is basically how the lotting on the surface is literally disconnected from this consolidation of the Marcellus cell as something that could be traded and become such a huge asset. This related to this. In a way, this is what we've been looking at. These are projects that I've been developing in GISA with my students. This is alternative ways of dealing with materiality, circulation, avoiding the notion of waste, and rather thinking of the perpetual kind of circular movement and reuse of materials, even like in this case, to make it possible to address issues of basically the agenda of the Paris Agreement without extracting new materials, mining the city itself and introducing knowledge that would allow for the same materials that could be removed from some buildings to be replaced in others, increasing their energy efficiency. Or this one that is a project that is proposing a different way for humans to relate to non-humans in a way that basically materiality, rather than being like the distribution of waste being a form of territorial injustice, to actually be the opportunity for an interspecies alliance in which what would be harmful at one point for humans could be metabolized by others that could find their habitat there. And these are sort of the proposals that I would bring. We are facing the need to think across scales, to connect events that are always perceived as independent in order to gain an agency that allows to bring new alliances, in which architecture, of course, would play an important role, but not isolated or alone, but rather, oh, sorry, that's the time, part of these entanglements. Thank you very much. I think this probably could be something to start discussing.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andres. Margarita, Neil, we'll pass it over to you guys for a bit.
Did you want to go first, Margarita?
You can go either way.
All right. Well, why don't I jump in? You know, my background is in political science, and I was really overwhelmed and struck by so many similarities that I've seen in terms of how you characterize architecture and where it is, and both the shortcomings, but really the wondrous possibilities of being this mediating force between humans and the rest of life, and between humans and each other. And as a political scientist, one of the things I focus a lot on is the role of government and the civic sector to play that mediating role. And that we really are at a point of crisis in terms of government, certainly in the United States, and a lot of it has to do with the notion of trust. And so what I write a lot about, my focus is on local government, is that local government and government generally has operated the same way for about 100 years. And that way is very similar to how you describe the role of architecture in a pejorative sense, meaning that government acts as though it has all the expertise, it has a monopoly on information, and it controls the environment in a space where it's us and them, or it's, you know, one and another, and does not take its role as a mediator very seriously. But I think that monopoly on information, that monopoly on being the mediator, has begun to crack. And you have seen this quite visually and in an arresting way with the attack on the Capitol, one of the most architecturally beautiful buildings in Washington, D.C., on January 6th, where it became quite visible to all of us. But one of the things that I have been documenting is that government is beginning to really take its role quite seriously. And I really want to emphasize a point that I think you did, and I was really appreciated this, that it's not so much government or architecture reaching out to the environment or reaching out to people or trying to invite it. When you talked at the very beginning about the work that you did on the pavilion, it's really thinking about how it's one and the same. How, when I think about, and this might sound a little strange, I also teach at New York University. At New York University, if there's one phrase we use again and again, is we don't say we're in the city, we say we are of the city. We are in and of the city, meaning that we don't have any architectural walls at New York University. And Tulane is a little bit like this in New Orleans. We are a part of it. And so in a way, when you are a mediator, you also need to become a part of it in a distributed sense. And what I'm encouraged by is that a number of governments are moving in this direction. Estonia is one of the best examples of this. And Estonia has begun to pivot its orientation towards national government by using the mediating power of technology. And that's another sort of crossroads that we're approaching, which is that to the degree government has something that is part of the built environment or the equivalent of the built environment, it is now technology. Because we all know about the physical environment, but we're now making sense of the digital environment. So we have stop signs on the road that tell you where to go and when to stop in the physical world. We do not have that in the digital world. And the wondrous way that government can be in and of the people, in and of society, is to use technology in such a way that it does have that positive mediating force. And we are starting to see that. But of course, it could go the other way, in which there are no rules and regulations, which is what we have now. And technology is used for sort of adverse purposes. So that's a very, I think, kind of conceptual response to what I found to be a really helpful and comprehensive talk. But I couldn't concur more, and I think to me it just sort of adds more credence to the benefit of bringing disciplines together to see how similar a lot of these themes and issues are, and I think we're on a similar crusade together.
Andrés, do you have feedback response to that before I jump in, perhaps, or it's another, or yeah, it's okay?
However you want, but maybe it's better to.
Okay.
Yeah.
My point is that as an architect, I'm curious to know how this new political views or this new form of seeing or putting the emphasis on relationships between agents and the relationship between materials, how can that lead to a new aesthetics? Or how is the aesthetic a potential driver of change? What is the role of aesthetic in that political change? I'm curious to know, because of course you have this field of research. You also have this, as designer, you build things and put them in performance in the stage, in public spaces, etc. How do you approach aesthetic, and how is that a driver or not?
Well, that's a great question, and also it relates to the previous comments by Neil that were also very, very exciting, and I will refer to them. Maybe I can start with your question, Margarita, and then I would like to also to refer to a number of things that Neil said. I think that it's important to understand that aesthetics play key roles that are not separated by many other nuances of processes that operate politically in our society's ecosystems. For instance, for me, the project of the ocean space is maybe one of the most difficult that I've, as an office, not only me, but together with many other people, we have addressed, because the question of aesthetics, when you deal with animals and other forms of being, and try to bring some notion of symmetry or kind of enrollment, it's not easy. Like, what are the aesthetics that could facilitate and be part of these mediations that Neil was referring to among people and fish, for instance, or about even different kind of humans, that some are trained as scientists, other are people that have to take decisions but don't have a kind of scientific background. But then, of course, if there's a need to mobilize information, or not only information, but just reflect forms of, or register fundamental parts of the life of certain beings that are, for instance, very slow or very fast, basically there's fundamental aesthetic questions that have to be taken into consideration. For instance, just the question of time is crucial. Many processes that are from which human life depends on, basically, are so fast that it's very difficult for us to sense them, or very, very slow. Just to calibrate different times as a form of kind of infrastructure that allows decision making to be equally sensitive to phenomena that are happening in remote time forms, I think it's in itself a aesthetic problem. And these are the kind of approaches to aesthetic that I'm very interested on. Aesthetics as something that is a problem of, let's say, mediation. It's the term that Neil used, and I think that is very right. And that is the kind of question that for me is crucial. What is interesting in that project is that it's an intervention of a number of historical buildings. And therefore, any decision needs to be taken in kind of as part of a very negotiated public process of participation, in which the historians of the city, the authorities, the superintendent have to be part of, and they regulate and sort of are moderated. And many of the discussions of, for instance, intervention on artistic monuments are dealing with the same questions. It's kind of amazing. Like, for instance, historically, the intervention of Napoleon basically consisted on isolating the space of humans from the lagoon, from the wetland ecosystems that wetland ecosystem that Venezia was before it was urbanized through kind of these modern ideas of the Napoleon urbanism, to basically being able to provide permeability to what was previously there, previous to Napoleon, requires a lot of kind of historical argumentation, and requires sort of a formal articulation of architecture, of which historians and, let's say, more conventional approaches to intervention of historical patrimony are kind of quite keen on and very savvy on. So for me, it's interesting to see that once these questions are on the table, forms of intelligence that have been nurtured for centuries, and that are disciplines that have to do with aesthetics, for instance, they immediately become very useful, and they can be called and convened for this. And I think this has to do with this Neil's question about even how do we work together, and how do we acknowledge the distribution, I think was the term that you were saying, Neil, that I loved, of knowledge. So I think your question, Margarita, is very relevant, right? I guess that's something that we share with politics, like with political sciences, right? Like an approach to aesthetic that is rather political. I don't know if you, Neil, want to tell us something a bit. Do you face the kind of discussions of aesthetics in your work, in your research?
Well, I mean, what's very interesting is I think it's only in the last 10 or 15 years that has become an issue that's more in the foreground. within the public and the civic sector. And I think it has a lot to do with this notion of having creative space or safe space where there can be a coming together of both citizens and those that have more formal expertise. And it's really quite remarkable to see. And so what you're seeing is a lot of local governments occupying formal industrial buildings and then repurposing them in a creative way to allow more synergy amongst, again, those within the civic sector and those that are more into the traditional community sector. And one of the best examples of this is something in New York City called Civic Hall, which is, I don't know if you know it, but it's probably the first new high-rise that's going to be built in Union Square, which is a very affluent neighborhood within New York. And it has, it's really being supported by local government, but being developed by an NGO with the express purpose of being an open creative space amongst those within the public and the private and the civic sector to come together. And it's been done in a sort of a pilot form in the Flatiron neighborhood over the last 5 years to wondrous benefits. And so one of the examples you see just as a creative space is you'll have an agency like the Department of Education, which is usually seen as cool, sort of aloof and removed from the teachers and from the students and from the parents within that education system. They have office hours at Civic Hall where you can just come in and open the door and say, hey, let's talk about not just my complaint with the education system, but how can we creatively rethink it? And so there's a lot of kind of human-centered design that's going on within that creative space. But what's really, I think, government leaders are seeing is it's impossible to do within the confines of the traditional government buildings. You do need to have that in open space. And when those spaces are designed in a creative way, it really fosters that sort of mediation that we're talking about. So it's very exciting to see. And again, I think you're seeing more of a desire to reach out to fields like architecture to better accelerate those positive civic developments.
Yeah. For me, it's also a question about, purity. I think that that's something that, it's sort of like a fantasy that it's been nurtured as an image of desire that, for instance, when we were working in the Barcelona Pavilion, we were always facing this kind of impossibility or undesirability of putting things in the upper part because it was supposed to be empty, pure, only very metaphysical things could happen there. And that was a huge load on the daily life of that building, because basically that meant that nothing that would show any interdependency with process in the making, social dimension of the pavilion, experimentation, aging, basically could be there. To the extent that I remember when we opened our installation, when the installation was open, there were huge complaints in the newspapers saying, oh, they filled the Barcelona Pavilion with trash. And it's kind of weird, like this trash was basically the vacuum cleaner or the cat, or the vacuum cleaner and the cat are not trash, so what is that was it was basically this impossibility to aesthetically make sense of Onis and a vacuum cleaner being together. Whereas, of course, if you want Onis to shine, you need machinery, you need a catcher, you need a person cleaning. So that kind of possibility to make sense of the processes by which things happen is quite interesting, or kind of something that I think that is it's part of a kind of heavy load that avoids a big part of the architectural field to be realistic somehow. But the other, I think, is more an activist thing in our practice that has to do with toxicity. And I have the feeling that the huge cost of producing this kind of green environments in privileged city centers that we see around the world. We see, for instance, Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo was transformed very radically in the last years its city center as a place that basically it has better air quality, it's much more green, it's really much more environmentally friendly, let's say. But that's done at a huge cost of basically redistributing that toxicity territorially. So basically, because that happened, for instance, that's a research that we're doing now, and that was done with, of course, international grants being given to the city, all these kind of sustainable programs to increase the quality of city centers across the world. But basically, by doing that, the prices of the properties in the city raised, and the people that work on basic jobs like cleaning or cooking, they basically had to move much farther, which meant basically that they have to drive 5 hours a day to get to work to the city center. The overall pollution is much higher, and the distribution of the pollution territorially is much uneven, and also intersecting issues of, let's say, inequality and increasing them. So what I think is crucial is also for architecture to move from the scale of the building to understand that the scale of the building is interacting with what happens at other scales in other places. This kind of transitioning in space, scale, and materiality of architecture is very challenging, but it's the only way that we can effectively address issues of environmental, climatic, social crises intersecting with each other. I think that's a fundamental set, because the entire culture of modernity is based on interscalarity, the possibility of really connecting all the scales, like in the movie Powers of 10, and it never worked. And I think we have to problematize that and move to a notion of transcalarity, in which we basically see that there's conflict in the way things move across scales, across space, across materialities. And that conflict requires chambers of discussion and chambers of political action. And for me, that's kind of crucial for architecture. It's totally changing our kind of heritage of this kind of linearity that modernism was producing. You could design from the chair to the city with the same single idea. Now we see that that's really not possible, that you require really that articulation to be very intended and to be participated and to be politically driven, because otherwise, basically, it's not going to happen. It's going to be producing inequality, basically, now, as we see it.
I think we've got a question from one of the attendees, so I'll try to summarize it. And I believe this is both for Andrés and Margarita, and Neil, feel free to jump in as you feel. From Tom O'Brien, a grad student at the school. First, really amazing lecture. So thanks, Tom. He was asking about the role of critique and beauty. And so he's wondering if you could all talk about the role of beauty in critique. He says that he noticed how perfectly organized all the objects you brought above ground were, in a way almost elevating them metaphorically as well as physically. Would it work the same if the objects were haphazardly thrown about? Is critique ever held captive by our desire to make things beautiful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's crucial. And that's a question about care in a way. I think that those objects, when you saw them in the basement, were maybe not let's say, preciously organized, but they were very much taken care of. So it was very beautiful, actually, to see how those objects were organized in the basement. For instance, I will give you an example. The curtain was aging, was fading away, but it was carefully placed on a pallet, and because it could be damaged by being in contact with the concrete of the wall, they put a cardboard to protect it. That was something that was showing a huge kind of care for the curtain. So when we were placing these objects on the upper floor, basically we were trying to be equally careful. It doesn't mean that we were trying to be sort of luxurious about them or, precious producing kind of a sense of preciousness, but being careful and caring for those things. But that was needed, and that's also important. That was not just kind of a gesture. For instance, at the time that we were, that our intervention was running in the pavilion, these objects were used. The people that were doing the maintenance of the pavilion would have to take the catcher and use it to clean the holes on the floor, on the travertine. Basically, they have to remove every single day the mud that could get into the holes of the paving to avoid basically plants from growing in the holes. And that they have to do first by kind of throwing water, pressure water with a particular machine, a catcher, and then to vacuum clean the entire thing. They would do that every other day, basically, in the pavilion. So basically those machines had to be taken from their podiums being used and placed again in the podium. So the design of the podiums was making it possible. So there was a sense of care. And I want to maybe talk about this because I have a feeling that probably we're rapidly moving, hopefully, let's see if that happens, but from a culture of extraction and exploitation of the others, us, or humans to humans, humans to other things, humans to other beings, to a culture of care. And I think that it will come with different aesthetics. It's coming with very different aesthetics in which basically the presence of anything in a common space requires care and requires sort of buffering, adaptation, kind of a work of making it comfortably be part of the common space. I'm not saying that this is necessarily an absolute good thing to happen. I think care is highly problematic at the same time. It's not something that would avoid basically the violence of our coexistence. Care is a form of violence as well. And it really requires agreements, alliances, accountability, of course. Like caring for someone is a form of control as well. It can be. So I'm not saying that moving from extraction and exploitation from care is going to make problems disappear. But I have the feeling that culturally, at least certain circles are moving to that sensitivity. And I think that we will have to deal with that and to make sense of it, but also to scrutinize it, to make it accountable, to create tools for it to be politically enacted.
Cool. Looks like we've got a new question in the chat, so I'll try to do my best again to characterize it and summarize it for the panelists. This is from Jesse Keenan, an associate professor at Tulane School of Architecture. He asks, what if the conflict in transscalarity, I think I'm pronouncing that okay. What if that means that people are removed from architecture because social behavior, for example, excess consumption and inherent inequality can be replaced by AI? Your capitalist critique of real estate marketing actually can be reduced to the idea that it is investment and not habitation. Therefore, people are not needed to fulfill the intent of the process of design and construction.
Yeah. Well, first, I'm really happy that Professor Keenan is here. I really admire his work, and he's really a source of inspiration for many of these works. Actually, some of these works were happening in conversation and discussion with him. I remember that Professor Keenan came to also a studio that I did in Princeton and was commenting many of these things. So I'm happy to. Yeah, I think this is crucial. I mean, the work that I've been showing was including humans to a big extent, but not necessarily. I don't think that design is something that happens exclusively among humans. I think we are actors among others that practice design, but not the only ones. I mean, it's highly documented the capacity of machines, contemporary machines, to basically produce forms of intelligence, design. I think a big part of the important designs that are now operating and shaping our societies are not something that is under the control of humans. We've seen how social media went out of control to a certain extent. A big part of machine learning is running the world without scrutiny. I did a research with my office. We did a research on Grindr, and we ended up concluding that Grindr, which is one of the, I would say, most important architectural and urban actors now, is out of control. Basically, there's 92 people working at Grindr. 5 of them are really engineers that can understand how it works digitally. These 5 people are basically controlling something that is used all around the world in almost every single country, in countries that are banning same-sex relationships and are kind of punishing it with death penalty. And they have literally no capacity to control, understand, regulate, design the way that technology is creating interhuman relationships. So it's really a problem of design. That design gains certain autonomy, and that those entities are often not accountable definitely to human intelligence or human engineering or human control or regulation. So this is crucial, that's just a tiny piece of evidence to what Jesse Keenan is saying. I think that I think a big part of the conclusion of this is basically that the capacity of other than humans to design and to operate, producing and contributing to the medium that we're part of, it's probably not been assessed before realistically. I think that modern ideas were very much putting human at the center, but I think that not necessarily the environments that we inhabit are the result of human control.
I think we have time for one last question, and we have a new question that just came in from Lori Smithy, a new faculty member to Tulane School of Architecture. Thanks, Lori, for the question. And this is another question for Andrés. And she's asking about the ways in which projects or devices, such as the Barcelona Pavilion and Powers of 10, frame out the political and social, and how that's striking. And she's wondering, when we're talking about always already being imbricated in an ecosystem or immersed in a digital environment, what frames do we look for?
Yeah. Okay, the first part, yeah, it's crucial because, you know, as much as if we change the way we think about architecture, immediately, of course, we change, or new possibilities are open in the historical account of previous architectures. Barcelona Pavilion was very much interpreted formally, the continuity of space, the kind of open plan, the frontality of the materials, the dissolution of the division between interior and exterior, very much looking at the scale of the human experience of the pavilion, and very phenomenological, like basically, what is that you perceive? What is that you see here? But I would propose a different reading of the pavilion. The pavilion was basically quite expensive. It was paid by a number of industry owners that were affected by the ban on trading that Germany was facing after the Versailles Treaty. Spain was under a new rule, the Primo de Rivera dictatorship, that was trying to transform the economy of Spain from more rural and industrial based, rural most of Spain, industrial in Catalonia and the Basque Country, to commercial. He was launching a new bank, the Exterior Commerce Bank in Barcelona, and was trying to take advantage of the Andalusia connection with Ibero-American countries, what was called then Ibero-American, like Portuguese and Spanish influence in South America and Central America and Mexico, and attracting public commissioners to Seville. And then he constructed they constructed a direct train line that could connect Seville to Barcelona. So those public commissioners could come to Seville and they would be then taken for a couple of days to Barcelona, where they could buy materials. Germany, or these industrial owners in Germany, thought that the pavilion was the possibility for them to find a market that they couldn't find in Europe. And take into account that cities like Havana or Buenos Aires were being built there at that point. Actually, the Barcelona pavilion was showing marbles that were used then to build the Bacardi building in the 1930s, not the Mies van der Rohe one, the other one, the kind of historicist one in Havana. This was a showroom. The Barcelona pavilion was a showroom to sell construction materials to public commissioners coming from cities in places like Buenos Aires or Havana that were in the need of buying a huge amount of construction materials. So basically the Barcelona Pavilion was a kind of marketing device, a commercial device to sell products. But the clever thing about, and that was what Lily Wright had been doing in the Deutsche Bourbon. She was basically running the course on commercial displays. So she was an expert on commercial display that was hired to do a showroom of materials like the one that it's in Union Square of Porcelanosa, for instance, or and that's kind of surprising that it was never reflected in the architectural historical accounts of the Barcelona Pavilion, that was all reflecting on the preciousness of the experience and not really about the commercial capacity. So why I'm saying this with regards to Laura Smith's question is because I think that on the kind of contemporary perspective, we could do other readings of architecture. And I would propose also an environmental one. The Barcelona Pavilion was using water lilies to clean the water naturally. It was applying a big part of the experiments that Mies van der Rohe was doing on that. And I think that there would be a very different reading of that, and many, many others that we could have now. So yeah, I think that probably we are in a moment, and not only through these ideas, but others, of reconsidering how we account for architecture, right?
Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And thank you, Andrés, Neil, and Margarita for your time this evening. It was really a fantastic conversation and lecture. And I mean, what an exciting night. And we got to cover everything from the bioengineering of celebrity to the aesthetics of politics. So I couldn't imagine a better way to kick off the semester talking about inhabiting the planet. So thank you again, Andrés, Margarita, and Neil. This was a great conversation and evening. And to all of the attendees, please join us next Monday on February 8th. We'll begin at the same time, 5:15 p.m., as we welcome Daniela Rivero Bryant for a conversation about human inhabitation and development. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure, and it was so nice talking to you.
Thank you, Andrés. Thank you all. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.